everyone, welcome to the Asian Hustle Network podcast. Today we have a very special guest with us. His name is Ray Zhou. Ray, CEO of Affinity, believes every opportunity begins with a relationship and knows that business networks become unwieldy and harder to leverage as they grow larger. In response, he co-founded Affinity, whose eponymous CRM captures and organizes data exhaust from emails and calendars and combines it with other data sets to provide the relationship intelligence needed by decision makers in venture capital, investment banking, private equity, and consulting, industries where relationship building is foundational to deal making. A native of the Bay Area, Ray met Affinity's co-founder, Shubham Goyal, at Stanford, where they were studying computer science. Their goal is to bring relationship intelligence to the world at large. Ray, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. That was a very eloquent introduction. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I mean, your background is very, very impressive, and we want to dive deep into your story and how did your childhood shape who you are today? So, can you walk us through what your upbringing was like?
I was born in Singapore and grew up in a family of scientists. My dad used to teach physics, in Singapore at the university level. And interestingly enough, when I was a kid, we actually came out to Silicon Valley because he wanted to come here to start a company. It was a hardware company. I think he kind of learned the hardship, back then of how hard it is to take an idea from an academic idea to reality, to creating a full-blown product. But that's kind of how we got started. And, I've been sort of consider myself in some sense, like, a California native, California lifey since then. I think some things that are interesting is, when I was growing up, there was a lot of, the way that my parents kind of raised me was they were always incredibly supportive of whatever I did. Their stance was always to be, unconditionally supportive, whatever it was. And I think that ended up coming to play when we started building the company, when we started Affinity, and I was contemplating dropping out to build the business. But, not having had an education or grown up in the US and the West, a lot of what they said was, whatever you do will support you, but we don't have a lot of sort of immediate background to tell you like how to navigate, the education system here or anything like that. And interestingly enough, after we started the company, the business, I ended up realizing that I kind of reconnected with my, dad on a bit of a different level. He had started the company at one point. It didn't quite work out, but we ended up having a common thread to talk about. So yeah, that's the way that
Well, I'm so glad that, your parents were very, very supportive of, anything that you wanted to do, because oftentimes we're kind of pigeonholed into doing things that they would expect us to do. Like your father being a physics professor, normally our parents would want us to kind of follow in the same line of work or try to influence to become a doctor or a lawyer or some sort. But I'm really, really glad that they were being very, very supportive of you. I know that you had graduated from Stanford around 2014, and that was also the same year that you had started Affinity. So I want to know, have you always had this kind of like entrepreneurial mindset? And if so, like, where do you think that came from? And how did you kind of like determine, like, what, I want to do something right after I graduate from Stanford and kind of start my own business?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess one really minor correction there is actually Stanford is incredibly supportive of folks who go build businesses in the middle of their program. And I actually did 2 years at Stanford. I didn't fully graduate before we started working on the company. So it was a bit of like a take a leave of absence type situation. And it's kind of crazy to think that was about 6.5, 7 years ago. So it's really been a ride since then. I think the entrepreneurial bug or itch, I never was interested in starting a company for the sake of starting a company. One of the things I've really reflected on or thought about is it's more the question of like, what's the impact that you can make on the world, right? Like one thing in general is I think as growing up, our education system tends to be really sort of focused on pigeonholing you to figuring out like, how do you define yourself based on your craft? So examples of the craft is like, the first thing that you're asked when you get into college is, what's the major that you want to study? If you chose computer science at Stanford, just because it's such a huge major, you'd then be asked like, what's your ideal concentration? And then after that, it's, what's your ideal job? What's your ideal job title? What's your ideal company you want to work at? And not to say there's a wrong way of thinking about things when you kind of look at the world from the lens of craftsmanship, right? But at least personally, it never really kind of spoke to me. Maybe to share a bit of a background, I was really interested in the life sciences in biology growing up, and actually was working in a wet lab for most of my my time in high school. And when I started picking up my first computer and programming, I was like, oh my god, this is actually a tool of the 21st century now. I can don't have to wait for my turn on the PCR machine. I can just, if I have an idea and I have a passion, I can instantly go build something out of it. And so I remember when I was starting school, I was like trying to look for that nugget of like what's kind of the intersection of computers and biology that could be interesting. And basically my point is like, I spent a lot of time soul searching to find like the right craft, like what's the right major, the right concentration. And I remember there's a talk that happened on campus. I forget who it was who gave it, but at some point, like when the person came in, basically said, you don't have to define yourself purely by your craft. You can define yourself by your cause, essentially. And it's this other lens of looking at the world, which is instead of starting from what's the job or company or description or industry that you're looking to be in, you start from the question of what are the problems in the world that really matter to you. Like what are the missions or the things that get you up in the morning every day and like make you really motivated to do what you do. And I ended up realizing that's kind of a mental framework that fit better organically with the way that I kind of saw the world and what drove me. And that's kind of how I stumbled into being a founder or starting a company. Frankly speaking, it wasn't, and I don't think in general, it's not a great idea to start a company for the sake of starting a company. Like the glamour of how hard it is to build a business like very quickly evaporates as you get started, like the first 6, 12, like, months, 2 years, etc. But if you think about it, like a company is really this incredible vehicle or vessel for change. Like it's this very specific permutation of people, right? Like, when you look at like, what are the recurring themes of backgrounds that, compose a company? It's like, you got, engineering, design, product, sales, customer success. That's a super, super specific like permutation. You sometimes wonder like, why aren't there more organizations that are like, 5% philosophers, like 10% musicians, et cetera. And I think the reason is because by definition, what a company is it's an organization that has to create a product or service that is fundamentally self-sustaining. Like if there's no market or demand for it, the thing itself will eventually die, right? And that's why like over time, you've seen sort of this idea, this construct of a business, like just continually being this incredible vehicle for creating change in the world. And that's what I saw as well. Like in building Affinity, it's not just like, hey, we can create a great product or service, but it's a self-sustaining like vehicle or vessel for making the world better, like implementing a vision and getting it to the hands of everyone. And so that's kind of where it came from. Yeah.
I'm really happy you see it in that way, right? And we always talk about this with other founders in the podcast too. Like your company is a reflection of who you are, and it's your soul, right? You have a product, but the company also has what it stands for, its values, morals. So I'm really happy you're able to dive deep into that and really give us like that explanation that the company is capable of like changing the world and making it better because of the founders and what it stands for, right? So I'm kind of curious too, because you started this company literally right out of college. How are you able to implement like a corporate structure as you guys are scaling? I found that kind of challenging in my case, at least when we were scaling and hiring employees. It's like, oh, I'm kind of glad I had that corporate experience to fall on. Like I know managers, directors, whatnot. But for yourself, like how did you draw upon these experiences to like, or like ask for advice to scale your company at a relatively fast rate?
Yeah. I think so. One thing in general is like, I don't know, the corporate structure is like for the departments that we have within the business, they're not fundamentally novel or fundamentally new. Sort of there are a number of like sort of major first pillar sort of departments and functions that drive the company. But I think the way that we kind of came accustomed to it, it really was sort of this like growth and learning mindset. You kind of touched on this earlier, Brian, but when we got our start, we had, very frankly speaking, like little idea what we were doing. I mean, it was the first time that, my co-founder and I, Shubham and I had built anything. And so we were just like hungry and curious to learn. One of my old mentors from Stanford, who's actually my advisor in the computer science department, he used to say, a little bit of slope makes up for a lot of y-intercept. And that's kind of generally the background of the types of people that you want to bring onto your early team. And I think we tried to really embody that to the best that we could, look at the world humbly and try to learn from the best people around us. And so we quickly identified, how do you scale up, a great product and build organization? How do you kind of take that product to market? That was the kind of question, the kind of problem where, we didn't need to reinvent the wheel to some degree, right? Like there are incredible SaaS and B2B businesses that have been built well before us, that to figure out like the right, team structure, the right departments, the right corporate structure, to make it all happen. So we just reached out to great mentors and advisors. We had an amazing network. It's actually very congruent with our mission as a company, which is, a part of the thesis of Affinity is that relationships are the most important asset that everyone kind of builds up over their lifetime and that they own. And we used our relationships to get connected to people who had done it before, had seen the journey and seen the movie, and they kind of helped pave the way for us building the company that we are today.
I love it. I really love your perspective and everything. It's really really deep. Like I think that when people listen to this podcast, they appreciate that you did take a lot of time to reflect upon everything. So I just want to take it back a step and talk about the early days of starting your company, right? I know you mentioned you kind of just finding people who have done it before to sort of help mentor you, but how did you select the right advisors and whatnot? Because in very early stages, and unfortunately in Silicon Valley, you're gonna talk to a lot of predatory people that, I want X amount of equity up front and whatnot. How are you able to navigate that field while still and essentially jumping up a hill, jumping off a cliff and building your house at the same time? Like, how are you able to learn as fast as you can to apply it to like your immediate decision and hope that it's the right decision?
Yeah, I think we were lucky to not have, have honestly like only had, great experiences with the mentors, the coaches, the advisors that we ended up working with. And I think that was in part because like the proxy for how we brought on, kind of these people that ended up making a really big difference, really shaped both the trajectory of the company and myself, like my own growth as a founder, was they were the best people that the folks that had already known, knew. And so when we got introduced or connected, it was there's already a pretty high probability that they were someone pretty awesome and who we would really jive with. But I don't think there was any sort of magic to it. Thinking back, I think more than anything, what at least I brought to the table, what my co-founder and I brought to the table was just a curiosity and being really open. I think there are definitely like, that's to your point, like, and sometimes there's some big egos in the tech industry in Silicon Valley. We were really upfront with admitting, like what we didn't know, which was a lot of things back then, but we were also really curious to learn and to kind of identify our blind spots and think about things from first principles and absorb as much knowledge as we could. And I think the early folks that we worked with that, they really took that to heart, and they love that, and that's what allowed us to build sort of a flourishing relationship. So nothing in particular, that specific that made it possible, and it's also possible we just got lucky, to be honest. But yeah, great people have always been at the heart of our, at least my founder journey.
Amazing. I mean, yes, luck does have a little bit to do with it, but I mean, you've built something incredible, and you were able to build your team so fast in such a short amount of time. And recently, your company announced an $80 million Series C funding. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Which brings, I believe, your total funding for the company to $120 million. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Awesome. And then I also saw that in 2015, you had your Series A. So that's like only a year. Can you talk about just like your experience in that 1 year while you were bootstrapping, and like what your experiences were, and like what kind of challenges did you go through during that 1 year that you were starting your company in 2014?
Yeah. So it was really an interesting journey. I think every company has a unique and, kind of founding story, right? So, for us, at least in the early days, like we were founded out of the computer science department at Stanford, basically. And we spent a lot of time in the beginning just building product and making all kinds of mistakes, as we were looking for a product market fit. I mean, Brian, sounds like you've sort of been through this experience before personally as well. I'm not sure, I think every company has a bit of a different journey, but for us, it was a lot of sort of working hard on the product. It is no trivial technology problem that kind of underlies the product that we've created so far. And it was some of the hardest like problems in like distributed systems and data syncing and everything. And so we just spent a lot of our time iterating there. And in fact, I think, funnily enough, like looking back, we probably spent actually too much time like iterating on early product. And there's a bit of hesitation in the early days to say like, let's just put it in front of the customer and see what their impression of it is. But yeah, I just remember back then when we got started, it felt like every hurdle that we had to cross seemed impossibly hard. There was one point in time when there was real technology risk. So we'd look at what we were doing and say, is this even possible? Like, we don't know. Thankfully got past that hump. Our early sort of customer base and user base was, and this was, really beneficial in hindsight, but all the investors that we were talking to, like venture capital firms, venture capital investors, et cetera, they were really interested in using the platform and the product. It solved a very clear pain point for them. And after we got past the technical hurdle, then the question became, how do we just get one sort of user who's actually among our own sort of investor base to be using the thing on a regular basis, just to actually log in, like forget using it constantly, just to log in. And that was seemingly impossibly hard as well. So it was like, oh man, we're screwed, like we can't even get our own investors who have every financial incentive to want to log into this thing to log in. But we worked really hard, we iterated, got past that. And then it seemed impossible for us to get them to log in and use it every single day. It's not every product out there in the world that drive or command daily usage. But we eventually got past that. And then, I had to get past the hurdle of like, how do we figure out our go-to-market motion, get someone to pay for it? What would they even pay? Like, it was a lot of experimentation and iteration that got us to where we are. But yeah, I think we just we're really persistent, resilient. We went after each challenge and didn't try to overthink it. And that's what brought us to finding product market fit and scaling the business to where it is now.
Is amazing. I mean, yes, those are very, very valid problems to solve. I mean, like us, Brian and myself running Asian Hustle Network, it's also like one of the key things that we wanted to make sure that everyone was, logging into Asian Hustle Network and like checking our platform every single day. It is hard. It definitely is hard. And yeah, you've built something amazing.
Thank you. Yeah.
I feel like you definitely need to give yourself a lot more credit as well, because you made it sound so easy.
I know you would say like we had this problem, we got over it.
Yeah, like, but as a fellow founder, it's like, man, this is hard. Like, you're facing a problem, it's hella hard, right? You're just sitting there, you're like, man, like, is this the right move? Like, experimentation, what's our boundary? It's all like figment of your own imagination what the solution is,
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I think it kind of never stops. So I think this is one of the parallels between I guess like science, having grown up in a family of scientists, and building businesses, building companies, building products, which is pretty much everything in building a company is an expression of a hypothesis, right? Like in the beginning, the hypothesis is like it should be technically possible to make something like Affinity. And then there's like hypotheses from there. It's, like, is there demand for this in the market? Can it drive like regular usage? But it's basically hypotheses stacked inside hypotheses. Like even right now, like, I mean, as we think about entering new industries and markets, building new products on top of our core data infrastructure, those are all hypotheses as well. There's no like assurance or guarantee that any specific thing is going to work. The difference between, I guess, like a scientific experiment or hypothesis is it's really clear after a certain point when you've done everything in your control, and it's just up to the universe to decide like what the answer to the question is, if that makes sense, right? So if you like set up your experiment properly, you've got your experimental variables, your control variables, it's all done, and it's like, all right, I know I've done everything I can. Now, is this thing going to work? Is it going to, cure cancer or, like defeat COVID or whatever? Like it's kind of out of your control at that point. In the world of business and building these things, it's a little bit different. Like the challenge is when you formulate a hypothesis, you can never actually tell, well, first of all, if something did work, then it's like, okay, cool. Like clearly that was validated. If it doesn't work, the thing that drives you, at least me crazy is, did it not work because there is something fundamental about the universe or the market? Like there's fundamentally no demand for this thing, or fundamentally there's some sort of a blocker, the world's not ready to use what we're using, or is it just because like you didn't execute well? And that's like the really crazy thing that I think drives you insane. Yeah, there's just in general, I think like probably the most pernicious aspect of human nature to anyone building a company is like this idea of wishful thinking. So like wishful thinking is you really want something to be true. And so it biases you to seeing everything in a light that, kind of confirms your bias. And it makes it sometimes hard to see like what the actual reality is, right? But yeah, when something's not working yet or hasn't worked yet, you really kind of constantly ask, like, is this wishful thinking, or, do I really think this is going to end up working? So yeah, it never stops, like we're still like constructing hypotheses and growing and scaling even from here on out.
Amazing. I mean, we know that Affinity manages relationship journeys, and I guess to kind of like get deeper into the product itself, because I don't think we've really talked about like how it actually works. But we know that it manages relationship journeys and unlocks like introductions to decision makers, which a lot of corporations need, right? Can you tell us actually how it works specifically and why something like this hasn't been kind of done before? Because there's obviously a lot of options for softwares for transactional relationships, but there isn't really anything for relationship journeys. So tell us like how it works and why it wasn't really done before.
Yeah. So we call Affinity is like the leading relationship intelligence platform in the world. And when I say relationship intelligence, you can kind of think of it as the next evolution of CRM, network management, contact management software, right? And the key difference between how a relationship intelligence sort of stack works is basically the idea is that there's all this sort of hidden data. There's these enormous volumes or sources of passive data exhaust about people's relationships that are essentially hidden inside, the streams of data produced by email interactions, calendar meetings. We're on a Zoom call right now, for example, all these different sort of tools that people are organically already using. And we think of those things as just ways for us to communicate, right? The thing that's not intuitive is that they're also data sources, like just by virtue of anyone in the world, just being a normal person, sending out emails, et cetera. It's spewing out this ocean of data that paints the most powerful picture of people's relationships. And so the heart of what Affinity does essentially is we aggregate and sync and analyze all that information. We apply machine learning to it to better understand and compute all these different insights. So it's automating away sort of the data entry of managing a really large network by hand. It's computing like who in an organization has the best chance of opening a door for you or making an introduction or closing a deal, right? It's automating sort of understanding the full history of a relationship from start to finish. So that's kind of the flagship product that we have put out there. And that's sort of the concept of relationship intelligence overall. As for why it hadn't been done, it's one of those things where like the standardization of technical protocols necessary to make something like Affinity possible, people only started really picking up on the fact that you could do really interesting and exciting things with all this data exhaust, I would say like roughly a decade ago. And that's made possible because like there are these like global ubiquitous standards, right? So email is a standard. Like someone can use Gmail somewhere, someone else can use Outlook or Microsoft email, like Yahoo Mail, et cetera. There's a global standard for how email is exchanged. And so you can tap into that data automatically, in a programmatic way. And so I think it's from a combination of just, the technology side of things is what enabled something like Affinity to basically exist. And that's what we realized about 7 years ago, when we started the business, which was we looked at the way that the biggest industries in the world were run. And basically realized that even though a lot of, as you mentioned, Maggie, there's a lot of great software in the world that's been built for what we call transactional relationships or transactional sales. So that's typically, the worlds of, retail or hospitality or honestly, a lot of technology sales. There wasn't a lot of really great software that was built for more of what we call relationship-driven industries or sort of the relationship-driven economy. Like when you look across the sectors and financial and professional services, like private capital, investing, consulting, real estate, nonprofits, et cetera, these are the organizations where they have a bit of a different view of their relationships. They're, less short-term, they're a lot more long-term, they're a lot more sort of strategic. You can never tell when you meet someone when that relationship is going to come back to unlock or enable the biggest deal of your life, right? And it's really that universe that we realized was being super underserved by legacy software. And that was essentially the enormous set of markets that we could apply relationship intelligence to really transforming the way they work. It's been a crazy, ride. I mean, since our founding in 2014, I think our platform has processed more than 18 trillion emails and calendar events to build this relationship graph, like computing the strengths of people's connections across a wide range of metrics. and it's powering more than 500,000 new introductions on the platform and tracking more than 450,000 deals per month.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, the way that you explained it, it just makes so much sense. And I
You just
love
feel
that
the
you,
passion behind there, you know?
yeah, yeah. I love that you like went out and actually saw how bigger corporations were operating. And, the fact that they probably didn't even know that they had this problem until, you presented the solution. And I think that's the way we're trending towards too, like building relationship journeys, right? Because when we do think about transactions, yes, it could be like a one-time transaction, but whenever you do have a transaction or relationship, you do want to, I would hope that, all corporations, organizations would want to continue that relationship after that transaction is done. That's how you maintain these relationships and, build more business with that one corporation or organization, right? So it's amazing. Yeah.
It's the, I think we really think that, it's the most powerful asset that, every, team, every individual owns. Like, on one hand, it's extremely true for the biggest, some of the most impactful, the largest industries in the world. But on the other hand, when you think about it, it's true for anyone, right? Like, how many assets are there that you kind of build up and accrue and take with you throughout your entire lifetime, as you go from school to school, from job to job? Like, literally, I can't think of more than maybe a handful of them. Like, maybe you have, like, the house that you buy or the bank account that you open. Or arguably those things, you could sell a house, you can close a bank account, right? But also arguably, like, they pale in comparison to the value, the importance, like the lifetime impact of the people that you meet, the relationships you build. People often say it's not what you know, it's who you know. And I think that's just incredibly true. And the other thing about, I guess, those industries, kind of to touch on what you mentioned, is I think this is maybe like one of the benefits of having taken a fresh look, as a technologist, into some of these industries like venture capital and banking, consulting, from the outside. Because I guess, like, when you've been in industry for super long time, you're used to having to spend hundreds of hours every month, like, entering data into your CRM, or otherwise accepting that just CRM is a lost cause. The data is always going to be stale. It's always going to be you working for the system and not the other way around, right? It's kind of easy to just accept that's just a reality. That's the nature of things. And when we went into sort of diving into seeing the way that the world of private capital or financial services operated, there were just so many moments in time when we looked at the way things were being done and just said, why is this happening? This is so bizarre. It's absolutely crazy. You guys do realize that the data necessary to create a 10x or 100x more effective solution, a better way to track your relationships, to just automate away all of the manual input that you're spending, like doing this sort of thing, all that data exists. Like, you already have access to it, like, and yeah, it's pretty counterintuitive. And I think that's what we're trying to get the world to wake up to, that everyone owns this incredibly powerful data asset, and they just need the tools to be able to unlock the value and potential of it. And so we're kind of on this, decade-long journey to democratize that, to make it possible for anyone in the world.
I think Maggie will agree with me that this is probably you're probably one of the most intelligent founders we ever had in the podcast. It's just like, I absolutely love it. I'm a computer science guy too, so I'm just like, damn, like, this is really, really good information, I'm really curious, because you mentioned earlier that this business idea started in a Stanford classroom. Like, what class was that? What fundamentals was that? And how does this idea even come about? It's like, hey man, I have this idea that I got during this class. Like, want to implement that? Like, what was the fundamental basis behind this? I'm kind of curious.
Yeah. It actually wasn't a classroom, but the department, basically. And in fact, a lot of sort of the early sort of designers, product people, like engineers on the team, had kind of, it was basically our friend circle. It was like the smartest people that we knew. We brought them on, and they brought the smartest people that they knew on, and it was just kind of this undulating, thing. And again, it's all about the people that we knew, right? But every company is started for a different reason. And to be very frank with you, Affinity was not the company that was founded because my co-founder and I were like born into the world, and like the first thing that baby Ray said was, oh my god, relationship management for financial services, it's super broken. frankly speaking, for a lot of the industries and sectors that we ended up building this sort of tech for, we were learning a lot on the fly as well. So I think there was a bit of like intention and serendipity. I think being at Stanford, it basically puts you at the very periphery of this incredible network of people, of investors, of like long-term thinkers. And there were a number of investors that we had met in the early days. They were this firm called 8VC. It used to be called Formation 8 back then, but they had renamed, as well as Pear Ventures, started by Pejman Azad and Mar Hershenson. Through complete serendipity, we had gotten to know them. So for the folks at 8VC, it was because their founding partners, Joe Lansey and Drew Oding, had come to Stanford campus to give a talk. And they were talking about sort of this Formation 8, or it's called Formation 8 back then, their sort of fundamental thesis. It was this thesis called Smart Enterprise, and they're kind of sharing that worldview with the entire room. And I remember back then my co-founder and I actually were living together. Actually, one thing I should mention, we had lived together for 7 years, and it literally took a pandemic to separate us. So we were both working together, living together. Like, Shubham's like basically like my brother or something, essentially. Like they say when you start a company with someone, it's like getting married to them, but we didn't take that to be meant literally. But there's one morning he woke up and he was like, hey, there's a really interesting talk going on. Should I actually go and check it out? And I could easily imagine a world where he didn't end up going, and maybe if that was the path that ended up panning out, like the company wouldn't have even existed, right? So it's kind of crazy how sometimes serendipity plays a role in that. With Pejman and Mar, for instance, I think we literally sent them like a cold email. So it was like a day or 2 days after they had set up their website, because they had set up shop in this like little office that was just on the perimeter of campus. And it was just like, honestly speaking, it was not a very well designed website. It was this like GeoCities like looking website, Times New Roman everywhere, but they had their email address on it. And so we just cold emailed them and said, wow, these folks look really awesome. They've got incredible backgrounds. Like Pejman has an amazing story, Mara has an incredible story. We just cold emailed them and said, hey, we're 2 students and we're really curious about the world and want to learn more from you. And would you be interested in just getting lunch with us? And so we did. And so it was those 2 threads, like getting to meet, some of these early folks that all ended up being investors in Affinity, that exposed us to the world of relationship-driven industries. Essentially, it was through connections and conversations with them that made us realize. I think we had ended up having like hundreds of conversations with every flavor of every sort of financial professional services type organization, sector out there in the world, and we basically kept hearing the same problems over and over again. It was like it was the same repeat things. Like people would come up to us and say, as if it was the first time hearing something, but it was always the same patterns. Like, I manage a massive network. I have no time to enter data about my network, and I feel like I'm working for my tools as opposed to my tools working for me. And that's when we realized, put 2 and 2 together and said, hey, there's all this data exhaust that is technically accessible that could help you solve your problems in an order of magnitude better way. And that's kind of what gave rise to the company.
That's so interesting. Like, I love hearing these stories and just like knowing what that foundation was.
You sold me. I'm about to be a customer after this call.
But that is true though. Like, all founders have that same problem. They manage all these relationships, and being a founder or just being like a C-level exec, you have to manage relationships. But very rare do they think about like, oh, how do I manage this in a better way? They think it's whatever they have is probably the best thing that they have to work with. So I love that you kind of did your research and found out that everyone has the same problem and there should be something done about it.
Yeah, the thing that's like kind of shocking often also in hindsight is like there is so much like luck involved, and I really do believe that. There's so many formative moments where if we hadn't just met this one person, or I don't know, so many of the incredible people that were part of, Affinity's early team, both like employees, like mentors, coaches, advisors, it's kind of daunting to think like, if this particular connection didn't happen, or if we didn't talk to this person, like what would have happened? Maybe we wouldn't be where we are. Maybe it'd be a very different company. I don't know. So it fills me with a lot of humility to kind of reflect on that.
Yeah, amazing. You and Shubham were also named Forbes 30 Under 30 in 2019. So congratulations on that as well. What was your reaction to that? And did you also share the news with like your father and your family? And what was the reaction?
Um, when we were flattered, obviously, we honestly, I don't know, didn't make too much of it, you know. I mean, it's you know, it was super humbling and you know, really awesome to be a part of the list. But you know, the I guess the reason that we do any of these things, and it kind of goes back to, you know, what I was talking about earlier about like what impels you to build a company in the first place, right? It's about like, you know, the mission and the impact and the people that you get to work with and the relationships that you build along the way. That's kind of like the first principles, like, you know, a driver essentially. I know that certainly was true for both me and for Shubham. And so, you know, to be honest with you, we didn't make a ton out of it. You know, we said, okay, this is awesome. That's great. Like, we're still so far away from actualizing the vision of Affinity. Like, let's get back to it, you know? And I think as for my parents, they've only ever been like unconditionally supportive of anything that, you know, I've, you know, worked on or done. And obviously they were happy. But I think part of that, you know, kind of unconditionalism was also like, they always said, you know, whether you succeed or fail or whatever happens, like, you know, as long as you're having a good time and doing what you're passionate about and what you love, like, we'll support you. That's what matters to them at the end of the day, right? And nothing else really. So they didn't have any sort of like particular expectations for, you know, how whatever thing that we were working on ended up panning out. And so I think we were happy, but it wasn't one of those things where it's like, you know, um, yeah, they're supportive, but you know, that's kind of that was the extent of it. And yeah, I love that about them. You know, it really was an empowering way sort of to grow up and to work on the things that I was really passionate about, and yeah, had the freedom to do that. So
I love that. Yeah, that's amazing to hear. How do you see Affinity scaling in like the next couple of years? Because I know recently you had about 125 employees officially now, and then I read that you're trying to get over to 200 by next year. So what do you see as like the next couple of goals for Affinity and yourself as well?
yeah. So I think it's essentially proven without a doubt at this point. Like, there's I mean, relationship intelligence, there's definitely sort of a lot of market appetite for it, you know, and at this point, the goal is to basically democratize, to put it in as many hands as possible. And so we're basically scaling up the business as fast as we can. You know, we're doing a lot to bring Affinity to as many industries as we can, as many markets. We're going global. The company today, I mean, the product today is already powering more than 1,700 institutions in over 70 countries. And there's a lot more to be done in, you know, Europe, you know, the Middle East, et cetera, just like many different parts of the world. And the other thing that's interesting is when you talk about sort of this concept of building a relationship intelligence platform, you know, kind of the flagship product that we built on top of our data infrastructure was Affinity CRM. So that's sort of, you know, the flagship product that we have right now. It's an end-to-end CRM. Like, when someone, you know, decides to go in and use Affinity, it's literally sort of like their complete source of truth, their database for all of their relationships. But there's more that you can do with the technology. You know, I think there's a lot of very interesting things that can be built when you sort of built this infrastructure that can sync all this, you know, hidden information, this huge volume of data that everyone has access to about relationships, but that no one's really thinking about. And so we're also starting to do some experimentation, you know, building new things, like trying out new things to figure out like what are new products we can create on top of that. And that's also a really exciting thing. I can't share too much about like the details there, but it's going to be a lot of scale, like growing the team, leveling up the team, and yeah, bringing the vision to as many sectors of the world as we possibly can.
Awesome. Well, we can't wait to hear and see all of this new events and things coming up for you in Affinity. So we have one last question for you, Ray, and that is, if you could give one advice to an aspiring entrepreneur, what would that one advice be?
Actually, I want to narrow it down a bit more. If you give one advice
Okay,
to
go
a
ahead.
college student right now that's thinking about leaving college to start their company or want to start a company in college, what advice would that be?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. That is a very good one. So I think there's a couple things that come to mind, but maybe one that I would probably focus on is you have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, essentially. Like so many times in a company's history, you're going to be thrown into a situation where you don't have a lot of prior experience for how to handle a situation, and it's a matter of you know growing and scaling yourself incredibly quickly and bringing on incredible people who can help you solve a particular problem at hand. It's really hard, like to get something off the ground and scale it up. I mean, like words can't describe how difficult it is. Funnily enough, when I look back, it was I think we were naive in many ways, and so we kind of naively just jumped in and ended up realizing, oh my god, this is incredibly difficult. But yeah, like we kind of developed essentially a framework. So whenever we were in a time of hardship, like understanding like, okay, like this is a situation that we've never sort of experienced or figured out how to handle before, like that's okay, right? It's not your first time being in this situation, and really having the framework to quickly learn and adapt and figure out like what's the best way to solve a problem. That kind of comfort with discomfort, I think, is probably the thing I would really alert founders to, because when you are a student in college, like you're going to have some strengths and weaknesses, and everyone has their own zone of genius. What's kind of the overlap between like the things that that you organically really love doing and that you're really good at. And it's easy to not want to step outside of that zone of comfort, right? If I'm an engineer, for instance, as an example, it's like, oh, I just want to keep writing code. Or if I don't know, if I study like business, et cetera, I just want to keep selling customers. And you kind of have to get out of your comfort zone, stretch into areas and learn new things that you might not be super familiar with. So yeah, I keep coming back to my old advisors like advice. A little bit of slope makes up for a lot of y-intercept, and the only way that you kind of maximize your slope is by, it's not just being comfortable with being uncomfortable, but almost seeking it to some degree, right? Like if you're not in a situation where you're pushing yourself to explore new territory, learn new things, like I don't know, it might not be a great end outcome. So you should always be looking to improve, like get 1% better every day.
I love that. Yeah, that's really, really good advice. Thank you so much for sharing that, Ray. And where can our listeners find out more about you and Affinity online?
Yeah. So for Affinity, I mean, we've got, we're at affinity.co, and we're on LinkedIn and also on Twitter. For me, I suppose my Twitter handle, rzao186, is my Twitter handle. So that's probably the best way to find me.
Awesome. We will share all of that in our show notes. I just wanted to thank you so much for being on our show today, Ray, and for sharing your story. We had a great time interviewing you.
Thank you, Ray.
Yeah, pleasure to be on. Thank you, guys.
We said it earlier, but I love this podcast a lot. It's absolutely one of my favorite interviews. It's so crazy how knowledgeable you are in this field and how passionate you are. And thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
I think you give me way more credit than I deserve, and I appreciate it, Brian. But yeah, thank you. Yeah, flattered.
Awesome. Thank you.